So earlier this year at Gen Con, I was walking around the vendor hall and I came across the booth for Mage Hand Press, which, if you're not familiar with Mage Hand Press, they are a third-party publisher for Dungeons and Dragons material. So they put out a lot of materials for like classes and subclasses and adventures. And at their booth, they're selling an adventure book called The Last Owlbear. Of course, when I picked up the book, the person at the booth was like, "Oh yeah, let me tell you a little bit about The Last Owlbear." And I said, "It's about an owlbear. I'm sold. You don't have to tell me anything more about this." So I bought it on the spot. A couple weeks later, once I finally got recovered from being at Gen Con, I read through this adventure and absolutely loved it. There's a lot of things I love about this. There are some things I'm probably going to tweak if I ever run this, which I will. And I wanted to share my thoughts with you all after reading through the adventure book. Before we get started with this video, just a couple disclaimers. One, I am not getting compensated by any means whatsoever from Mage Hand Press. They're not aware that I'm making this video ahead of time. I bought this book at Gen Con with my own money. If you are planning on ever playing in The Last Owlbear, there will be spoilers. So if you're somebody at my table or somebody that you know I'm going to be running The Last Owlbear for you, definitely hit stop and don't watch this video any further, please. I know who you are. And last disclaimer, I will have links to The Last Owlbear if you want to check it out from Mage Hand Press, as well as some other links to my article for the review of The Last Owlbear, as well as anything else that you might want to check out in the description below. So definitely check that out after this video, during this video, to see what's in there that might be of interest to you. Oh, another disclaimer for you is that I have only at this point read through the adventure. I have not ran it or played it yet. So once I've done that, I'll probably create a video talking about my experience after I ran The Last Owlbear, but this is all based on what I've read so far. So keep that in mind. Also, I did add chapters to this video. So if there's a particular section you want to skip ahead to or go back to, definitely check out the different chapters I have here for you in the YouTube video timeline below. So let's get right into it. Let me tell you a little bit of a brief description about what The Last Owlbear is about. So The Last Owlbear was created by Mike Hollick, Lucas Zellers, and Benjamin Gita, and it's a 4-chapter mini-adventure that takes characters from level 5 and level 6, and then it uses the Dungeons & Dragons game system. You can play this as a standalone adventure if you want, or depending on the world and setting you're playing in, you can add it into an existing campaign of yours. This is set behind that backdrop of a world where owlbears have slowly been dying out due to environmental destructions. A world truth about this adventure is that no one has seen an owlbear in over 50 years, but the party's patron, an Arcana alchemist named Priya Saren, had received word of a sighting of an owlbear nearby the forest of Mosswood. After Priya urges the party to join a caravan to find and rescue the owlbear to bring back to her so she can try to repopulate the species. But along the way, the party will face challenges, ranging from encountering other rival parties, to confronting fantastical creatures and lands, to coming up with practical solutions for barriers along the way. Okay, so my review of this is going to go chapter by chapter, and there's only 5 chapters. What's first is starts with the introduction, and then 4 chapters that covers the adventure. So let's start with chapter 0, the introduction. Now, there's a few things I like in the introduction that I think really stands out for me. The first one is they include stat blocks of different creatures that the party is probably going to go up against in combat. And they designed it in a way that is really condensed and gives you the information that you need pretty straightforward. It reminds me very much of Daggerheart's adversarial stat blocks. And so this book came out before Daggerheart was released and all that. But it gives me that kind of sense and feel of being able to look at the information I need very quickly. So I really like the design of the stat blocks that they created here for The Last Owlbear. Another thing that they had in the introduction chapter is they had a block for content warning. So that way you can tell your players what is going to be in this adventure. So if you want to make it, adaptations or anything like that, you can definitely do that in your session 0. But they kind of give you up front what are some of the things that might be triggering and problematic for people ahead of time. So that way you can go ahead and have those conversations and let people know about that. I haven't seen a lot of adventure books that has something like that, and I really love that they included it here. I'm hoping that this might become a industry standard at some point, where you have a block of here are some potential content that might be triggering for some of your players that you might want to talk to them about. So I really love that they include this in here. Now, in the introduction, it talks about how this is centered around the idea of human destruction to environment and how that has impacted the owlbears that led them to extinction, right? So they talk talk about how some people might bring up, well, why don't you use magic to try to fix this? And they do a pretty good job of explaining, why that's not as simple, because the things that led the owlbears to extinction to begin with is still going to be present. Although in the last owlbear, the whole goal is to try to repopulate them. So I think that's something that may be something you have to think about if you're running this adventure and someone asks that question. But the other challenge that's going to happen here is if you are already playing in a campaign setting where the players have already interacted with owlbears, or is this not a truth in your setting that owlbears are going extinct, then this might be harder to pull in if you want to use this as part of your campaign. So I think there's a couple easy fixes for that. One, you could just say that, some patron from a different plane or something like that, or even a different multiverse is needing people to help, and they're going around, the different universes to ask people to help them out. And so you can, port them into a different multiverse if you want, or you can just kind of change it to a particular species of owlbears going extinct. And then that could really work as well too. So, uh, it's a little bit of a challenge to begin with, but I think it's still pretty easy to be able to pull it into a campaign setting if you want. But it runs really well, just as is too. So let's talk about chapter one, the Caravan. This is a really good and strong start to the adventure. Right away, they lay out 6 events that your party should be going through on their way to try to find and rescue the last owlbear. So this is going to be a kind of like a trek journey where it's going to take several days for them to get to the Mosswood Forest where the owlbear has been sighted. And it gives you 6 events to pick from, and they recommend choosing one of the 3 that's really designed for your characters to kind of introduce themselves, which range from just talking around a bonfire on a long rest, or you're helping the cook make better food because apparently he's a terrible cook. But it also has some other encounters as well too that makes things just very fun and challenging. There's one that can lead into a combat, but the other ones I really enjoy because they're a little bit more practical in terms of thinking about how to work together as a group, and then using skill checks to try to achieve those things as opposed to using combat. But they really encourage the using creativity for what your characters can do to kind of solve the problem. So one of the encounters or events that they have is that you're taking a large caravan and wagon across a bridge and it starts to break. And so they have to do a series of skill checks to try to get across the bridge before it falls. But they also say, if they use a clever use of like one of their spells, like maybe mending to try to fix one of the pillars in the bridge or something like that. I really love those because that allows the party to try to do something a little bit inventive and creative that kind of is something that you might not get all the time in other adventures as well too. So they give you 6 different options. I recommend choosing at least 3, but you can run all 6 if you want to. Now, one of the things I do recommend is before you start this chapter, definitely express to your characters, to your players, that this first part is meant to be a journey, a trek to get to the Mosswood Forest, so that it may take about a week before you get there, and really hone in on the fact that it's going to be a long trek. And so there's probably going to be some things along the way that they're going to encounter. So that way they're not thinking that this is kind of like a, long slog until you get to the owlbear that's just kind of, throwing things in there. This is designed to have multiple things that can affect your journey and can affect how well you get the owlbear as well too. And so it's really designed for that sort of a journey aspect of it. But nothing's more frustrating than thinking that you want to get to the owlbear in the next like session or two, and you might not get there because there's a couple other things that you're trying to do along the way. Now, at the end of the chapter, they have an event that the party will go through called Bonfire Night, where, just as you guess, this is when they take a long rest. But what I really enjoy about this event is that it's not just people kind of sitting around a campfire and kind of talking about like what they're doing. They have designed like 4 different things that players could interact with if they wanted to as options. So they have the leader of the caravan, Melville. I forgot his name. Hold on. Melvare Bannermore, who is in a tent and he's playing a storytelling game. And so if characters decide that they want to go check that out, they can participate in that game, and they draw like 4 cards, like a tarot reading card kind of kind of thing. But they could draw 4 cards, and basically the players will roll 4d12s, and it kind of determines what shows up on on those cards, and then they tell a story based on that. And if they succeed in doing that, or they tell something that is a really clever story, then you can give them inspiration for that, which I really love, because then it kind of gives them a reward for participating in that sort of thing, right? There's also one where you can buy supplies from their from one of their people, Sophia Fontaine. She is the kind of like the second in command that helps supports Melville. You can also participate in some sort of like competition where you try to throw some bullets at people and knock them down and all that. And it's like a gambling event. You're betting on who's going to stay, who's going to be the last person standing. But there's also an option where the party could see a campfire, like half a mile away, that if they want to go out and visit that, they can see who's out there and kind of interact with them. And then they we'll find out later, but that's actually the rival party that shows up in the adventure later. So I really love this because it takes the idea of a campfire, long rest, and be able to give players something to do with that can affect the game later on, but just something a little bit more interesting than just sitting around the campfire and just talking about themselves as well too, which they can definitely do and still do if they would like to do that. But I think giving them a couple of options on what else they can do is fantastic. So I really love this event and this scenario that they came up with in chapter 1. So after the party have made their trek and finally make it to the Mosswood Forest, that takes us to chapter 2, The Hunt. And just as you might imagine, this is the chapter where the party tries to locate and trap and capture the owlbear, so that way they can take the owlbear back to their patron Priya in order to try to save the owlbear from extinction. Now there are 2 things in this chapter I really enjoyed that I'm going to start using in my other D&D games for other kinds of events and encounters like this. They introduced something called Hunt Stages and something called Threat DC. Now the Hunt Stages pretty much takes an event and splits it up into 3 different sections, because what you decide to do as a player and party in each of the stages will affect the potential outcome in the final stage. Kind of reflecting on how well did you do in like leading up to and preparing will make things easier or difficult for you in trying to succeed in capturing the owlbear. So stage 1 in the Hunt stage is the pursuit, where you're working with other NPCs and your party members to figure out where the owlbear might be and the best way to set a trap in order to capture them and lure them into the cage that you brought. Stage 2 is called the bait, and this is the part where you try to get the owlbear's attention and lure them into the cage and the trap that you had set up for it. And there's a couple of different kind of events. It's like a mini chase in a sense, where there's a few things that happens along the way, and depending on how well you do in those things, that can affect the threat DC, which I'll talk about at the end of the Hunt stages here. And the last stage is called the snare, which is pretty much the final stage of the hunt, where you get the owlbear into the cage, hopefully successfully. If not successfully, then it gives a couple of suggestions on what to do, or it even says if the owlbear gets killed in the process, then the adventure ends. And I think it gives like an idea to like how you might be able to maybe retroactively, change this, or, how you can continue the adventure without it if you want to not have that be like the end result here. But my favorite thing about this chapter is in the Hunt stages, you use something called the Threat DC, and it starts at 12, and it's the difficulty class for the skills that you are trying to succeed in by setting up the traps and the bait in the first stage of the hunt. So if you're successful in that, then the Threat DC stays at 12 for all the ability checks and anything else that you're trying to succeed in later on in the hunt. But if you fail any of them, then the Threat DC gets increased, which means that whatever you're trying to accomplish later in the hunt, then that becomes a little bit more difficult for you to achieve. And that reflects how well you did in the first stage. Because if you think about it, if you were not successful in setting up the trap, or if you made a sound while you're trying to set up the bait and you capture the owlbear's attention, then you're caught off guard, which means that it's going to be harder for you to be able to do the thing that you're trying to do. So I really love this idea of using a threat DC as a base level difficulty class for ability checks. And then when they're trying to accomplish things, if they fail, then it increases to use as a DC for that final task that they're trying to accomplish in this stage. Reminds me a lot of countdowns that's used in other tabletop role-playing games, and I just really like the fact that this shows how your ability checks are really significant in the thing that you're doing or trying to accomplish, as opposed to something that might seem isolated. If you're, doing a task here or there, it affects the whole, event or whole purpose of this chapter. So I really love the idea of taking an event and bringing it up into stages and then having it affect the threat DC, which becomes a difficulty class of you trying to succeed in the thing that you're ultimately trying to accomplish. So after hopefully the party has captured the owlbear alive, it's time to go into chapter 3, Dangerous Cargo. And this is the pretty much the climax of the adventure. So after the party has gotten the owlbear, they are going back to the path that they took to get to Mosswood Forest to return the owlbear to their patron Priya. Now, there's a lot of things I really like about chapter 3. I think it's really well done, but there's a few things in this chapter that I want to highlight to you if you ever decide to run this adventure. In the very first part of chapter 3, the caravan gets confronted by the rival party called the Bramblethorn Company, who's been hired to kill the owlbear, essentially. And they try to bribe the caravan by presenting them a chest that's worth like 30,000 gold pieces, all these magic items, things like that. That's clearly enticing for a character if they want to have one of those things, but it's a trap, right? The chest is illusionary. The only thing that's really real is a necklace of fireballs, which does go off if somebody opens up the chest as kind of like as a explosion trap, basically. The only problem with this is that the adventure doesn't really say what to do if the caravan says that they're not going to take that bribe, because it goes through details, if the characters do accept that here are the things that happens and things they want to think about, but it doesn't say what does a caravan do if they deny the request for the bribe, essentially. And that's probably the most common thing that's going to happen. So it's probably an easy way to kind of describe it to be like, this was something that we were asked to offer you. If you don't accept it, then, we understand, blah, blah, blah. And maybe it's very calm, but one of the other things you got to think about is that earlier in the adventure, they may have interacted with Bramblethorn Company at the bonfire night in chapter 1. So those are things you might have to think about, where if somebody thinks that, why would they just kind of allow us to go if they are wanting to kill the owlbear? Like if somebody has that sort of mentality, like why would us denying them the bribe stop them, right? So that's something to just kind of think about ahead of time. Another thing that I thought was interesting is that there's another encounter on the way back, and again, this is going to be a trek journey on the way back to the tower, so there's going to be some encounters along the way. But one of them is they get confronted by an Etten, and in the adventure, it says that if somebody succeeds on an insight check, they can tell that the Etten is being paid with a new club and not with a promise of gold or anything like that, because their club is rotting. I don't know how you can explain how an insight check would be able to allow you to deduce or figure that out necessarily. So you might want to think about how narratively you might want to make that make sense, or just kind of finagle with it and try to figure out, if that's something that you want to keep in there or whatnot. But the whole idea is for the party to try to figure out like what is their motivation, so that way they can try to use leverage to get out of that situation if they want to. The last thing to think about, and that'll lead us into the discussion about one of the encounters I really enjoy in this chapter, is when the caravan gets back to the Priya's tower, they will get confronted by Bramblethorn Company, and they will, essentially threaten to kill Priya unless they hand over the owlbear. What's interesting, and I understand what they did here, is that they say when combat breaks out, the only people a part of the caravan that really gets involved is Merrillville, because he's kind of used as a way to be able to protect the owlbear or Priya if something were to go wrong. But the rest of the caravan just kind of runs away, I guess, or they said it's worded in a way that says like they kind of run to the edges of the tower or the property or something like that. That is something I find that's kind of odd, because this whole time, like, they face an owlbear, they face all these threats. It doesn't make sense to me why they would just run away or not participate in the combat narratively, when they've faced like a lot of different things that's probably just as dangerous as these 4 characters that they're going up against, and there's a lot more of them as well too. I understand why they did this mechanically, because that could take a long time to have the combat go, but narratively you have to think about how does this make sense here. So you can either say that there was a trap that the rest of the party fell in, or maybe something as simple as when they got closer to the tower about a mile out, the Merrillville, the leader of the caravan, Caravan pays everybody and they go on their way, but the characters go because they all know Priya personally, and so they're going to, you know, make sure that the owlbear gets there. So I think there's a couple of ways narratively you can explain that a little bit better, but that's something to just kind of keep in mind once you get to that part, is how do you explain the rest of the party not participating in this, especially since they've been hunting like all these different kinds of creatures along the way. It just doesn't make sense why they would be scared by 4 humanoids when there's a lot more of them. So those are things to keep in mind about chapter 3, but I like to talk about my favorite aspect of chapter 3, which is the combat between Bramblethorn Company, who is the main antagonist here, and the party. What I love about this is that they kind of set up like a hostage situation where once the party gets to Priya's tower, they tell the party that they need to give up the owlbear or they pretty much kill Priya, and they have Priya at, like, you know, at the very top of the tower. The wizard has her, and it's like 40 feet or something like that, and he is ready to push her off the cliff to her death unless the party, you know, agrees to the terms, or the party comes up with something clever to try to either distract them or something along those lines. Now, there's a couple things that will not work. Some people might think that, oh, I'm going to cast Featherfall. Well, in the adventure, it says that the wizard that's holding Priya hostage has counterspell ready for that sort of thing. But somebody might try to cast a web, or they might try to distract the wizard and all that. And so there's a lot of great opportunities on how to creatively think about solving this. And when you go into initiative for combat, they have set it up to where the first round of initiative is all about trying to save Priya if she does get pushed off on the ledge. So you don't have to worry about anybody attacking you or anything like that. The first round's almost like quote unquote surprise round, which I know that's, you know, that's a whole nother topic another day, but it's basically a whole round where you're trying to save Priya, and hopefully the party's successful. If not, they have a couple of things in there to say like how Priya could be saved if everybody, you know, fails their attempts or things like that. Or you can, you know, just allow Priya to die, and then that adventure is pretty much going to end because Priya was really the only person that's going to try to rescue the owlbear, at least within this adventure here, right? But I love this because I love having combat situations where there's a level of complication that's added instead of just we're going to attack, hack, hill, slash, you know, the whole time. I love it when we think about how can we use things in the environment or the circumstances or situation to add that level of complexity to kind of challenge the players a little bit beyond how can I, you know, hit the thing the hardest, the most, basically. And so that's what I love about this encounter is the inclusion of those complications. So I'm always going to be a fan of those types of encounters that's been written up like that. Sorry I've said encounters a whole lot. My bad. And hopefully the party has saved Priya and stopped Bramblethorn Company from trying to kill the owlbear and possibly killing them off. You get to chapter 4, the experiment. And this is the end of the adventure where it kind of leads all up to this, where the adventurers are trying to help Priya in her experiments to recreate another owlbear so that way they can populate and save them from extinction. And in this chapter, instead of any more combat encounters, there's actually a series of ability checks that allows you to try to help Priya in her experiments. And so I think there's like 3 or 4 that the party has to do. And the first one I really enjoy because you're trying to put everything into the right place by almost not necessarily cloning the owlbear, but you're trying to do like some DNA modifications, and you have to roll and succeed in some of these ability checks. Otherwise, if you fail, then narratively it describes like what happens in this experiment that makes the owlbear turn into a bear owl chimera. If they are successful in their ability checks and trying to create this experiment, then the bear owl chimera is probably a little bit more reasonable to go up against. But if they fail one or several of those ability checks, then they create a bigger monster which adds different kinds of not only elements to the monster, but mechanics that can make it a little bit tougher as well too. So I really like that. Again, anything that shows what the characters are doing in the game is affecting the outcome of what they're going up against, I absolutely love. The one thing I didn't enjoy and think is going to be a challenge in this chapter is the section called Transmutation Cocktail, where the players have to figure out the right amount of potions they have to combine in order to grow the cloned owlbear into the right proportion, which in this case is actually a mimic. But the challenge I have with this is that this is based on the player's knowledge about colors and how they interact with each other. And so it's not just like, red, blue, and yellow, but you also need to know, how cyan, magenta, work with each other as well too. It's problematic because I don't know how many players would actually know those things, and there are people who are colorblind, which they did give guidance on how to handle that if somebody is colorblind and they're at the table, which I do appreciate. But what if the dungeon master is colorblind as well too? This is one of those puzzles where I generally do not enjoy puzzles in D&D anyways, but the fact that this kind of relies on you having to have some sort of prior knowledge on something that doesn't really have anything to do with the adventure, it's something that I kind of struggle with. So I think I'm probably going to change this or just remove this completely when I run this adventure, because it's just kind of hard to follow how the party is supposed to figure this out. And it's just something that I don't enjoy, the character or the players needing to have some sort of prior knowledge that exists outside the adventure to make this work. So that is it for the last Owlbear. Even though there's a few challenges I had with this, it is very small and minuscule compared to all of the great things about this adventure. I highly recommend checking it out. I know I'm planning on running this adventure for some of my friends, as well as probably on Start Playing Games. So once I run it, I'll definitely do a follow-up video, let you know how I thought about the last Owlbear after running it, and see how that compares to my reading review as well too. But if you have any questions or thoughts about this adventure, or maybe you played it as well too and you have some advice or thoughts about it, definitely leave a comment below. Any of the information I shared should be in the description below as well too. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Take care.